Chapter 51. Identity. Keira instinctively took out her cell phone. She didn't really want to make a scene with Isla in front of Mrs. Olsen. Even if the truth came out on Monday through others, it would be better than having a face-to-face argument now. Mostly, she was afraid that Mrs. Olsen would get too agitated, which might affect her health. But now that Mrs. Olsen had called, she didn't need to keep Isla's secret anymore. Just as the call came in, Isla rushed up to Mrs. Olsen and immediately hung up the phone.
Mom, no!
Mrs. Olsen was stunned. She frowned and looked at her.
Why not?
Isla bit her lip.
I just spoke with Jake, and he suggested that we shouldn't blow this issue out of proportion and handle it internally. If Dr. South were to find out, even if he doesn't blame Keira, the Horton Group has to show some form of punishment as an apology to Dr. South, which may lead to a more severe punishment.
Mrs. Olsen paused slightly.
Is that so?
Yes.
Isla looked at Keira, a flicker of cunning light in her eyes.
Keira, you're found guilty with full evidence, and you've offended Dr. South. It will be best for you to apologize promptly and submit a sincere letter of apology to the company. Then I won't pursue your responsibility, and Mr. Horton will surely be lenient with you on behalf of the Horton Group.
As soon as he heard this, Taylor said,
Shirley, did you hear that? Nothing serious will happen to Keira. You just worry too much about everything.
Keira was silent, her gaze lowered to her own phone. If she were to call back now, the truth would be clear. But would Mrs. Olsen be able to accept it? Mrs. Olsen was such a pure and upright person. She only wanted her children to be healthy and honest and never to go astray. Could she accept that her own daughter was actually a devious person? Keira remained silent for a while and finally looked at Mrs. Olsen. She decided to lay the groundwork first.
Mrs. Olsen, I'm not that stupid. It wouldn't be a big deal if I couldn't complete the project. I have no need to steal Dr. South's solutions just to save face. Besides, have you ever thought about something? Did Dr. South agree to provide technical support to the Horton Group?
At her words, Mrs. Olsen pursed her lips. Isla interjected.
I've already explained this to Mom. I took her phone and called Dr. South without her knowledge, and he has already agreed.
Just as Keira wanted to refute, Taylor berated in rage.
Keira, you're unrepentant! It was all in vain that Shirley cared so much about you. Isla has decided not to hold you accountable, and yet you still dare to try and pin it on your sister?
He motioned toward the door.
Get out!
Keira gave Mrs. Olsen a long look, seeing the latter frown slightly, clearly not believing her. Keira sighed, turned around, and left the room. Her words would give Mrs. Olsen more room to think, and they could also serve as a buffer. When the truth came to light on Monday, hopefully Mrs. Olsen won't be too emotionally affected. As Keira left the room, she heard movement behind her. Turning around, she saw Isla rushing after her. Isla's eyes flickered.
Keira! The Horton Group doesn't really want to blow this out of proportion. I suggest you consider leaving voluntarily. That way this whole thing will be over.
Keira chuckled. Isla had stolen her solution, and now she definitely wanted to calm things down quickly. In a cold manner, she stated,
We both know who stole whose solutions. There's no need for hypocrisy here.
Hearing this, Isla lifted her chin in satisfaction.
Of course you stole mine. There's a plenty of evidence. You have no chance to deny it.
Seeing Isla with no guilt in her eyes, Keira responded,
You think you've covered your tracks?
A cold glint appeared in Isla's eyes.
Are you referring to Dr. South? Do you expect Dr. South to confront this issue himself? Keira, you're so naive. This minor issue won't bother Dr. South.
The implication was that Dr. South was completely unaware of this situation, nor would anyone bring it up with him. Keira had no choice but to carry this blame. If Keira wasn't Dr. South herself, she might have been put in a passive position. Keira gave a smile.
Ella, when you walk on a dark road too many times, you are bound to encounter ghosts.
Leaving this behind, she walked away. The smile on Isla's face gradually faded until all that was left was spite. Louis was already in a meeting. After the meeting ended at 8 in the evening, he walked out of the conference room and happened to see a sneaky figure standing nearby. It was Jalen. When he heard the conference room door open, he came over.
Louis, I have a favor to ask.
Louis didn't stop but walked toward the elevator.
Go on.
Jalen glanced around to make sure the other executives at the meeting were at a safe distance. He then briefly relayed the situation in the research and development department. In the end, he pleaded.
Keira just graduated and might have lost her way trying to make some achievements. Anyway, the company didn't suffer any losses. Could you perhaps handle this leniently?
Louis entered the elevator and pressed the button for the underground car park. Seeing that Louis wasn't responding, Jalen continued.
Louis, I've never asked you for a favor before, but Keira is an invaluable talent. I really can't bear to see her cut short her career.
Louis gave him a cold glance, his deep eyes devoid of warmth.
You think she stole it?
Jalen stood there, stunned. Ding! The elevator arrived. Louis strode out and headed straight for his car. Through the rearview mirror, Tom saw his boss's expression and cautiously asked,
Boss, you think Keira didn't steal it, but if that's the case, did Dr. Sells steal from her?
Louis looked up and glanced at him, but said nothing. Tom muttered to himself,
You do seem to trust her quite a bit.
Louis leaned back in his seat, lost in his thoughts. It wasn't that he trusted her, but there was an inherent pride in her that made him sure that she wouldn't steal, nor would she need to. As for why her solution was the same as Dr. South's, was it because of Samuel Morgan? He remembered that Keira had a boyfriend, and the two were in a hurry to get married. Was that man Samuel? The car soon arrived at the hospital. Louis got out of the car and strode into the building, just as he saw Keira coming over. The lights in the corridor were dim, and most of the people were wearing striped patient gowns and looked worn out. Only Keira had a fair complexion. Her casual gait radiated a sense of vitality, as if she were the only scenery in this hospital. Louis's expression unconsciously softened. The two met at the entrance to old Mrs. Horton's ward. Louis didn't enter the room but asked indifferently,
Need any help?
Keira paused slightly and smiled.
No?
Louis's voice suddenly turned cold.
You don't need my help, so are you going to Samuel? Well, I admit I overstepped.
Keira nodded.
I do need his help. He can better verify my identity.
At her words, Louis paused and asked,
Your identity?
Chapter 52, Scumbag. Louis narrowed his eyes. What identity? As Samuel Morgan's girlfriend? At this moment, he pieced everything together in his mind. Keira wouldn't steal the plan, and the solution was too complicated. Jalen said that no one but Dr. South could complete it in such a short time, so Keira's plan must have been provided by Samuel. But Samuel didn't inform Dr. South. Otherwise, Dr. South wouldn't have sent it separately to Jake, causing this misunderstanding. The business world was complicated. Why did Samuel take Dr. South's plan without notifying him? Would he really clarify things for Keira? Louis asked uneasily.
Are you sure he'll come?
Of course.
You trust him that much?
Yes.
When had Samuel ever dared to disobey Keira's orders? Her matter-of-fact attitude suddenly made Louis feel a little frustrated. He only found her infatuated with love. Suddenly, he reminded her,
Miss Olson, don't forget we're still husband and wife legally. I don't want to start any rumors.
Keira was perplexed. She looked at him with slight confusion, not understanding why he would suddenly say this. Seeing this, Louis felt more frustrated. He loosened his tie and said sternly,
While our marriage is still legal, I hope you behave yourself.
Leaving these words, he strode into the ward. Keira didn't know what to say. Did this man have an unsuccessful meeting today? How temperamental! His words were utterly nonsensical. She didn't think too much about it, but followed him into the ward and went to accompany old Mrs. Horton. Outside the suite, Louis instructed Tom.
Look up Samuel Morgan's information.
Yes.
Tom worked very efficiently. Within half an hour, he gathered all the information about Samuel.
Boss, it's sent to your phone.
Louis opened the file on his phone and saw Samuel's basic information. He was 27 years old, a brilliant student who graduated from Cambridge University. 3 years ago, he became Dr. South's agent, managing his company. In the past 3 years, he had been diligent and steady, and the company was now preparing to go public. Louis continued to scroll down, but found no more information. He frowned slightly.
That's it?
Tom was bewildered. He had even found Samuel's university transcripts, and the boss still felt it wasn't enough. He asked with confusion.
Do you want a...
Louis said lightly,
His personal life.
Tom's mouth dropped open in surprise, but he soon recovered.
I will check it right away.
Half an hour later, Tom sent the information to Louis's mobile phone. Samuel was generous and went through girlfriends every 3 months. His ex-girlfriends had nothing but praise for him. At present, he was involved with several women, clearly not an ideal boyfriend. Thinking about Keira's trust in him, Louis chuckled. He took his phone and walked into the ward, prepared to show her this evidence. But as soon as he walked in, he saw his grandmother flipping through the dictionary with her reading glasses, and Keira squatted on the ground, playing with the dog. The little puppy raised its head, wagging its tail vigorously at her. Keira was smiling all over her face. She was incredibly beautiful. Her smile was breathtaking, as if she was the purest scenery in the world, making people not want to destroy it. He paused and his fingers tightened around his phone. Should he tell her this cruel truth? For a moment, Louis was conflicted.
What's wrong?
Old Mrs. Horton suddenly asked, looking at him suspiciously. Louis pressed his lips together and quickly turned off his phone.
Nothing.
However, old Mrs. Horton didn't believe him.
You've been staring at your wife for so long. How could there be nothing? Do you have something to say to her?
Upon hearing this, Keira looked up, her eyes shining as she looked at him. Louis was speechless. He felt a wave of heat rush up to his face, so he quickly averted his gaze and cleared his throat.
You seem quite lively, Granny. Are you ready to be discharged from the hospital?
Upon hearing those words, the energetic old Mrs. Horton immediately clutched her chest, putting on a weak face.
You brat! My chest still hurts!
How could she let the young couple live together once she was discharged? She would be like a child of divorced parents, having to choose one side. Unlike now. On the second day of her stay, she remodeled the ward. She put 2 comfortable beds in the ward, one for her and one for her granddaughter-in-law, and a sofa bed in the outer living room for the brat to sleep. It might be a bit small, and life was somewhat hard, but at least the 2 of them could see each other daily. When they developed feelings for each other, she would bring her granddaughter-in-law back to the Horton family. Thinking of this, old Mrs. Horton laughed. There was no sign of chest discomfort at all. Louis was speechless. So was Keira. That night passed without any event. The next morning, Keira was reading a book on neurology when she suddenly received a call from Luca Barker.
Keira, come to the university now. Something happened to the Professor Miller.
Keira frowned and said,
Sure.
She stood up solemnly, walking quickly toward the exit. As she went downstairs, she prepared to hail a cab. Behind her, Tom's voice rang out.
Miss Olsen, Mr. Horton asked me to give you a ride.
Keira paused slightly and didn't refuse.
Oceania University. Thank you.
As soon as the car stopped at the academic building, Keira jumped out and rushed toward Professor Miller's office. The door to the office was wide open, with a group of students gathering around for the spectacle. Keira rushed in and saw a red-faced Professor Miller standing there, aggressively looking at the dean of the College of Energy. He snapped,
A student's academic status affects their life. You can't just expel them on a whim. Last time you said her character was problematic and her background was problematic, so you directly canceled her postgraduate recommendation without my agreement. Today, if you don't give me a reasonable reason, you can't leave here.
Keira heard this and paused for a moment. She thought something happened to Professor Miller. Was he standing up for her? But expelled? She looked at the dean just in time to hear his strict words.
I just received the news that she stole Dr. South's solution and claimed it was her idea. This kind of student tarnishes our school's reputation. Of course, we have to deal with it.
Professor Miller growled angrily.
That's impossible. Keira isn't that kind of person.
The dean sneered.
This is the internal information I have just received. Can't be false. We're about to hire Dr. South as a professor, and if we don't punish her, how can we gain Dr. South's trust? Do you know how many schools are fighting over him?
Professor Miller understood right away.
So you're doing this all for Dr. South. But I'm her advisor. I won't sign off on your decision to expel her. I'll never sign that document.
The dean was furious.
Miller, how can you be so stubborn? Comparing Keira Olsen with Dr. South is ludicrous, and even you aren't important enough.
Hearing this, Keira stepped forward.
Without Professor Miller, there will be no Dr. South.
Episode 53, Acknowledgement. Keira wasn't lying. When she was a freshman, she found her major very uninteresting until she took a class with Professor Miller. That was when she decided to pursue this path. One could say that Professor Miller was her guiding light. Her empathetic words silenced the entire office. Both Professor Miller and the dean looked at her. The dean furrowed his brows and said angrily,
What nonsense are you talking about?
As Keira was about to reveal her true identity, Luca, who stood beside her, rushed in front of her.
What Keira said was right. Without pioneers like my professor, where would Dr. South be today?
He shouted,
New energy research has only developed in recent years, but my professor has been studying it for over 20 years. Without him and other professors laying the groundwork, how could we possibly be today's achievement? Dean, the words you just said were utterly biased. Even if Dr. South were here, we should address our professor as his senior.
The dean choked on his words and glanced at the students by the door. Many of them were Professor Miller's postgraduate students, and they were all looking at him indignantly. The dean cleared his throat.
Indeed, my earlier comments were inappropriate. However, Dr. South's standing in the field is unshakable, and this will be clear to everyone. Dr. South can form an entire research team independently, which significantly advances the development of new energy. So, Keira Olsen, how could you steal his plans? This is absurd!
Keira responded.
I didn't.
The dean sneered.
The Horton Group has all the evidence and witnesses. Even if you don't plead guilty now, you can't escape. Keira Olsen, since you're here, it saves me the trouble of summoning you. You've been expelled from the university. I'll publish an announcement shortly, so your disgraceful actions don't tarnish the reputation of the school further.
Professor Miller shouted angrily.
Dean, Keira Olsen has already said he didn't steal. The matter is still under investigation. and your reason for expelling her is completely insufficient.
The dean glanced at him.
We must keep this matter under wraps to avoid giving people the wrong impression that Dr. South cannot tolerate a student. The official reason for expelling Keira Olsen is disciplinary violation. As far as I know, she's chronically late, skips plenty of classes, and often scores 0 on assignments. This is why the school has decided to expel her.
Hearing this, Keira was really stunned. It's often said that a university experience without skipping classes wouldn't be perfect. Which student hadn't skipped an occasional class? She certainly skipped many classes as the content taught by the professors was too basic, so she simply didn't attend. However, when the professors discovered that she got perfect scores in exams, but 0 on regular assignments, since it didn't affect her overall performance, they didn't pursue it further. Who would have thought that this would now be used as leverage against her? Keira's demeanor turned cold. Professor Miller, shaking with rage, retorted,
You are utterly shameless. I'll say it again. I won't sign this document. Keira Olsen is my student, and without my signature as her advisor, you have no way of expelling her.
The dean's face darkened.
Professor Miller, you're blatantly stubborn. Since you're not cooperating with the school's decision, I'll have no choice but to suspend you.
Professor Miller exploded.
Suspend me if you wish. Do you think I'm afraid of you?
At these words, the dean laughed.
Professor Miller, suppose you're suspended, your postgraduate students will have nobody to guide them temporarily. How do you plan to handle their graduation defenses? Let me see. You have 6 postgraduate students, right? So, are you planning to delay them all by 1 year?
If a postgraduate student failed their defense, graduation would be postponed by 1 year. Many unscrupulous advisors, in a bid to have their students continue helping them, would deliberately fail them, causing the students to delay graduation year after year. In this respect, the students were always the disadvantaged group. At these words, Professor Miller was taken aback.
You are absolutely despicable.
The dean was actually using his postgraduate students to force him to sign the document. Being a career researcher, he wasn't used to cursing others. At this moment, he could only stomp his feet in fury. Professor Miller's postgraduate students, on the other hand, immediately turned pale, and they all looked at him anxiously. The dean, however, laughed.
Professor Miller, what is more important? 1 student or 6? The choice is yours.
He took out the expulsion form and handed it to Professor Miller.
Are you going to sign this or not?
Professor Miller clenched his fists. He turned to look at his postgraduate students. Some of them had already secured jobs and were waiting to receive their graduation certificate to start working. Some were engaged and were waiting to get married after graduation. However, he couldn't sign the form. What was black couldn't be turned into white. He was at a loss on how to face his postgraduate students. Keira stepped forward and asked,
Are the senior officials here today?
Professor Miller shook his head with a bitter smile.
They're all at a conference in clans, including the school principal and vice principal.
It meant that there was nobody present who could reprimand the dean. Keira looked down and suddenly smiled.
Professor, how about you take a few days off at home? We'll discuss this when they return.
If she exposed her identity now, the dean would simply dismiss it as a misunderstanding, and the matter would be kept under the rug, especially as no actual injury had been done. But if the dean pressured the professor into taking a leave of absence and took action against his postgraduate students, exposing everything after that would mean the dean's downfall. After hearing this, Professor Miller sighed deeply, looked at his postgraduate students, and reassured them.
Don't worry. Even if I'm suspended, I'll wait for the return of the principal and the vice principal, and I'll appeal to them. I won't delay your graduation.
Keira then added,
Professor, you can consider it as taking a few days off for yourself. I'll have an answer for you on Monday.
Upon hearing this, the postgraduate students looked ashen-faced. They understood the professor's choice since he was always the fair and impartial type. Yet they were involved out of nowhere, and the instigator was telling the professor so carelessly to take a few days off. It made them all feel very uncomfortable. Luca immediately stepped forward and tugged at Keira.
Keira, if you don't know what to say, just remain silent.
Keira was perplexed. She personally escorted Professor Miller home. On the way, Professor Miller expressed his concern.
Keira, how are you going to deal with the Horton Group? Just the reputation of Dr. South alone could crush you. Who would believe you? Why would such a high-profile professor like him want to steal your solution?
In Professor Miller's eyes, a conflict between his brilliant student and Dr. South must mean that the latter was shameless enough to steal Keira's research findings. But when he asked this, Keira just laughed.
Professor, Dr. South didn't steal my solution.
Professor Miller was taken aback.
Then who really did this study?
Me.
Keira said indifferently,
Or you can say it was done by Dr. South.
Episode 54, Return. Keira sent Professor Miller home and then returned to the hospital. She spent most of her time in the hospital with old Mrs. Horton in her ward. Lewis was working in the outer office. Tom stood beside him, quietly recounting the events at the university, and then whispered,
Miss Olsen's cold demeanor has caused a stir. They are criticizing her on the school's internal network.
After that, he handed his cell phone to Lewis. The incident had become a hot topic on the internal network of Oceanian University, and everyone was discussing it.
I don't get it. Why would Professor Miller defend such a loser?
She stole Dr. South's study, of course. We would expel her. What's the point of keeping her?
She's just stirring up trouble.
I totally agree with you.
There were those who cursed her regarding this incident, and there were also those who condemned her for other things.
The theft hasn't been proven yet, and it's understandable that Professor Miller wants to protect her. I was at the scene at the time, and I respect Professor Miller's actions, but that doesn't stop me from hating a certain classmate. Professor Miller made a sacrifice for her, and she has no gratitude. Even saying that the professor should go home and take a few days off. It's cold-blooded and ruthless, as if Professor Miller's sacrifice were taken for granted.
I was also at the scene, and I feel this person is too thick-skinned. Those graduate students of Professor Miller are really unlucky to have the same tutor with her.
The more Lewis read, the darker his expression became, and by the end, he looked gloomy. He tossed the phone back to Tom.
I just remembered a quote from Carlo Collodi. When the village dog barks, the rest of the dogs follow, even though they don't know why they're barking.
Tom didn't know what to say. What a sharp tongue. He was comparing those foolish and naive college students to dogs. Tom subconsciously said,
If Miss Olsen sees these criticisms, she might feel hurt, right?
As soon as he said this, Lewis hesitated and asked tentatively,
Do you think she would bother to read the university's internal network?
Tom smirked.
Boss, Miss Olsen just graduated. At her age, who wouldn't check the school network for gossip?
Lewis said indifferently.
I don't.
Tom thought,
That's because you act like an old man, completely insulted from the internet.
He cleared his throat.
Young people these days like to go online.
Lewis raised his head upon hearing this and looked through the glass window on the door into the ward. The weather was gradually getting colder. Keira wore a camel-colored shirt and was actually leaning back on the couch reading a book. Strands of loose hair fell onto her forehead. She tucked the strands behind her ear. Through the curtain of thick black hair, he could see a part of her slender, fair neck. She was focused and serious. The sunlight fell onto the floor by her feet, where the puppy was curled up, sound asleep. The scene painted a picture of peace and tranquility. After a while, Keira seemed to be getting a bit tired. She put down her book, stretched, and began to reach for her phone. Louis abruptly stood up and strode to the door in a few steps, opening it. Both people in the room looked at him in unison. Old Mrs. Horton adjusted her reading glasses and looked at him bemusedly.
Brat? What is it?
Louis pursed his lips and looked at Keira.
Miss Olson, it's nice outside today. Would you like to take my grandmother out to get some sun?
Keira glanced outside and nodded. She gently nudged the puppy to wake it up, then helped old Mrs. Horton out the door. Taking two out at once would save some time. The three of them soon arrived at the hospital park, found a chair, and helped old Mrs. Horton to sit down. Keira stared absent-mindedly at the lake in the distance. She was trying to digest the knowledge about neurology she had just read. Suddenly, a low voice came into her ear.
Miss Olson, do you often go online?
Keira looked at Louis, puzzled. Louis, dressed in black today, and his custom-fitted clothes, highlighted his cold demeanor and restrained elegance. He wasn't looking at her, his expression aloof. It seemed like it was just idle, small talk. Keira gave a nonchalant answer.
I don't really like it.
Louis nodded. Keira then turned to look at old Mrs. Horton. After several days, she now knew Louis better. He was a man of few words, so after that small talk, he probably wouldn't say anything more. Just as she was thinking about this, she heard him speak again.
Nowadays, many people are restless. Under the anonymity of the internet, they like to vent their anger and dissatisfaction. The internet is like a lawless place, amplifying the evils in people's heart. You don't have to take what's on the internet to heart.
Keira was perplexed. Just as she was wondering why he was suddenly saying these things, her phone vibrated. She took a quick look. It was a WhatsApp message from Luca.
Keira, don't visit the university network for a while. A group of students are just echoing on each other and their words are too harsh.
Keira was a little surprised. She seemed to understand why Louis was saying those things. She put down her phone, a bright smile blooming on her face.
Miss Horton, don't worry. The words on the internet can't hurt me.
Louis was a little embarrassed before returning to his usual self.
Well, I was only afraid it might affect my grandmother's mood.
Keira laughed softly. Her laughter made Louis uncomfortable, so he stood up, his expression still calm.
I still have work to do. I'll leave my grandmother in your care.
All right.
Back in the ward, Louis said,
Cancel the Monday morning meeting.
Tom was surprised.
But that's when we have our multinational meeting. Okay, I will cancel it right away.
He gave Louis a doubtful look. Was Louis planning to go to the administrative department on Monday to openly defend Keira? He felt uneasy. After Louis Horton took over the Horton Group, there were many who were dissatisfied. If he were to bend the rules for personal reasons, Tom suddenly felt irritated. Keira just joined the company a few days ago, and she had caused such a big problem for his boss. Jake relied on Dr. South to gain a foothold in the R&D department. Now she has crossed Dr. South. She was really good at stirring up trouble for his boss. If Louis really intended to protect her this Monday, Tom decided that even if he would make Louis angry, he would stop his boss. He couldn't let his boss make a mistake. When Keira returned from her walk with the old lady, she found that Tom was looking at her strangely. She didn't pay much attention. It was soon Monday. After breakfast, as Keira was preparing to go to the Horton Group, her phone vibrated. It was a WhatsApp message from Samuel Morgan.
Boss, the plane landed on time. I'm about to go to Horton Group.
Episode 55. Relationship. Keira and Louis arrived at the Horton Group in his Bentley. As they got out of the car, Louis suddenly asked,
Will Samuel Morgan arrive on time?
Keira replied.
I think so.
Louis pursed his lips and continued.
Actually, I have some information about Samuel Morgan. I'll tell you after we deal with today's matter.
He planned to tell her about Samuel Morgan's womanizing behavior. The agony of elongated pain was worse than a moment's suffering. Keira glanced at him, surprised.
All right.
She got out of the car and walked toward the elevator. Just as she reached the elevator, she overheard a few colleagues whispering.
Did you hear? Someone was caught stealing ideas from the research and development department.
Who? Someone's really crossing the line? How audacious!
I heard it was the new intern. They must have some connections in the company to dare do such a thing.
What kind of connections?
Someone pointed upward.
I heard it's related to him. Hence, they placed the intern in Jalen Riley's group.
That guy is domineering and forceful. The higher-ups have been on their toes for the past month. He wouldn't blatantly protect his intern, right? Isn't he worried about leaving a bad impression by mixing personal affairs with work?
Well, I heard that guy was spoiled by old Mrs. Horton. When he was a kid in Oceanian, he was like a little Tryon. After so many years, showing bias to an intern wouldn't mean anything to him, right?
The company has its rules and regulations. If he acts recklessly, won't it cause public outrage?
He's young. He doesn't care about these things.
Isn't it Jake younger? But look at the people that hire from the company. Dr. South is leading figure in the new energy industry. Now look at the intern of that guy. Comparing both sides, it's evident that Jake Horton is more reliable.
Absolutely. Like father, like son. His father, Mr. Horton Sr., was always strict with himself and lenient with others. Speaking of which, Mr. Horton Sr. worked his way up diligently from the grassroots. Why didn't he get the position? Why was it taken by that man?
Keira hadn't planned to pay these people any attention. After all, she found herself in an awkward predicament and realized that people were bound to talk about her behind her back. But she hadn't expected that the conversation would shift toward Lewis Horton. She narrowed her eyes. Having been working since middle school, she wasn't really an office rookie, so she immediately inferred that someone was fueling the fire behind the scenes and planned to drag Lewis into the mud. She recognized the person who had initiated the topic. It was Arian O'Neill, a researcher from Group 2 and a henchman of Jake Horton. Keira remembered the news Samuel Morgan had helped her look up. The first branch of the Horton family wanted to seize power back. She could sense the tension between Lewis and the first branch of the family during her last visit there. Jake wanted to use this issue to stir up public opinion. Even if it couldn't inflict any real harm on Lewis, it could still undermine his reputation in the company. Keira scoffed. She stepped forward and spoke casually.
It's fine if you gossip about me, but shouldn't you check for any surveillance cameras around before spreading rumors about the boss?
As soon as she said this, the group of people immediately raised their heads to check their surroundings. Seeing no surveillance cameras, they breathed a sigh of relief and then realized they had been played. Everyone turned toward Keira.
Who are you?
Before Keira could say anything, Arian said,
Let me introduce her to you. She's the new intern from the Research and Development Department.
Arian smirked and said,
Miss Olsen must be close to Mr. Horton. The crime of stealing ideas is a significant one. And now that all evidence is complete, she still has the nerve to show up at work as if nothing happened.
With that, everyone turned their gaze toward Keira, their brows furrowing. All of them were office workers. If their hard work was stolen one day, they would undoubtedly be outraged. However, Keira wasn't intimidated by these glances, but rather asked, somewhat puzzled,
I'm close to Mr. Horton?
Arian immediately said,
You're not going to deny it, are you? It was Mr. Davis who personally escorted you to the R&D department. Our team members all saw it.
As he said this, he sighed, pretending to offer consolation.
Even if Mr. Horton is backing you, you shouldn't have stolen Dr. South's concept. Do you know the significance of Dr. South to the R&D department? Our vice president, Jake Horton, invited him over, spending great efforts and resources to make a huge contribution to the R&D department. If this incident makes Dr. South leave, even Mr. Horton couldn't bear the worst of the entire R&D department, could he?
Everyone around nodded instantly, but Keira suddenly laughed.
You got it wrong. I'm just an acquaintance of Mr. Horton. He has always kept a low profile and didn't make a fuss about hiring me for the company.
Arian was startled.
Oh, what did I get wrong?
Just then, the elevator arrived and the group of people walked in. They didn't notice that Louis and Tom were approaching from a distance and had heard their conversation. While Louis didn't show any change in expression, Tom's face immediately dropped. As expected, someone was using Keira's situation to scheme against his boss. But at this point, Keira didn't try to avoid suspicion. Instead, she brought the attention back toward his boss. It was just too outrageous. Tom couldn't help but say angrily,
Boss, did you hear? She's openly claiming that she's connected to you. Everybody knows about her relationship with you now. What good would do that for her? She's so stupid.
After saying this, he said,
Boss, I think you really shouldn't get involved with her matter. Everybody knows about your relationship with her now. If you still choose to protect her, in everybody's eyes you will become a despotic ruler who disregards justice.
Louis narrowed his eyes. His stern expression didn't change. He looked ahead and said lightly,
Only the weak are swayed by opinions.
Leaving these words behind, he straightened his clothes and strode into the exclusive elevator for CEOs. Tom followed him into the elevator, only to hear him speak with authority.
Go to the administrative department.
Tom should have known that Louis's decision wouldn't change. Tom pressed the button reluctantly and sighed to himself. It's no wonder that everyone made those comparisons. The R&D department was the core of the company, and many people kept an eye on it. In the past month, the R&D department had taken in 2 people. One was Dr. South, Jake's connection. The other was Keira, the boss's associate. The 2 were worlds apart. Tom inhaled deeply. If Dr. South were Louis's connection, then Louis would surely win this battle in a splendid way. Ding! The elevator arrived. The curtain was officially raised on this case of stolen plans.